Well, many years ago, I was teaching high school history, American history, in Seattle, Washington. And in the course of the years that I was teaching, which weren't many years because I got pulled back to working here, I was nominated as one of two teachers in the Seattle public school system, in the high school system, to receive a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. But one paper that I had to write, that each applicant had to write, is relevant to our current studies this week, so far as I'm concerned. And this was the requirement to write what was termed my intellectual autobiography. It was an interesting exercise, and I think it's one that many people might engage in one sense. Now, I was about 30 years old at the time. I'd been a member of the society for about 11 or 12 years. I had been here on the staff at headquarters for 6 of those years before I moved to Seattle to teach school. And therefore, I'd been instrumental in establishing some lodges and branches and study centers and so on. So my intellectual autobiography was filled with descriptions of the impact that theosophical ideas had made on my mind, on my consciousness, on my life. Now, as I have reflected on that experience through all the intervening years, I've come to recognize in ever-increasing measure the extent to which my life has been shaped by the great ideas of the theosophical worldview. And it has occurred to me from time to time that perhaps in one sense I started out with those ideas a kind of overlay of ideas which had been there from childhood. In other words, so often theosophical ideas become something like a veneer that's put on, and nothing much has changed underneath. This is often what has happened. On the other hand, one has to look at the fact that those ideas of the theosophical worldview are inevitably framed by a number of factors. That's why I've put on the board, what you see is what you beget. Because often how we view reality, how we view each other, is what comes out of it, is what we beget. We create it as we go. Of course, first of all, are the educational and cultural factors. And I want to look at some of that. So one can begin to put these down, the impact of these ideas and how they have shaped our lives. So we can say education, cultural background, and I'd like to look at this because I think rather than looking at the ideas, we need to look at really how those ideas have either sunk in or have become, as I say, the surface veneer, and nothing much underneath has changed. The second thing is the role of language. And again, I want to look at some of that. Third is context with other cultures. And of course, even in the United States, we're familiar with that now, how many other cultures there are, how many other influences, and we are in contact with them, aren't we, all the time. And of course, then is our relationships. With friends, with others, and so on. The influence, for example, early on in my career of such a person as Clara Codd. Clara was a tremendous influence on my thinking, on my way of acting, in my lecture work, and so on. Again, a great influence was my contacts with Mr. Krishnamurti and his probing and his inquiring, and not just in his public talks, but over many times of having lunch with him and in a small group, therefore, and that kind of interaction. So you can think of this in terms of your own life, as I say. As we look at the impact and the ideas that have shaped our lives, that has been through these filters, if I can put it that way. It's been filtered always in this way. So it's a kind of four-sided framing. Here's the frame, as it were. And I realize that it may not be so much the ideas, therefore, that have shaped my life, but my interpretation of those ideas. And this fourfold framing, in one sense, has been similar for each one of us. We've interpreted the ideas in accordance with that framing, and yet in our own unique way. And how our interpretation has changed through the years. For example, I certainly shudder to think what I said in my first lectures in the society as I went around. Perfectly sincerely. Of course, much of it I took out of the book and rephrased in my own language, as it were, but it came directly out of the books that I was reading. So how, from those early years when we sort of mimicked the ideas, which leads me into another subject in a sense, and that is a concept that's being used in some areas of psychology today, known as memes. It's a wonderful idea. Memes is spelled M-E-M-E-S and pronounced memes. And the idea is that just as we have a genetic inheritance and our genes reflect themselves, so in many senses our modes of behavior are copied and transmitted. It's an idea, a behavior, a style, or usage that spreads from person to person within a culture. Memes, whenever you shake hands or cast your vote, you're giving life to memes. Incidentally, this notion that memes exist and evolve was first proposed by Richard Dawkins of the University of Oxford, who coined the word in 1976 in his book, which became a bestseller, The Selfish Gene. The thing that also bears on this is the fact that some time ago there was an article in the journal Newsweek under the heading of Science, and it was called Heretics in the Laboratory, and explored the question, can a creationist be a good scientist? And so this article cited a number of respectable scientists who do not accept the prevailing and predominant scientific paradigm, which is known as the evolutionary theory. But one of the scientists that is cited is a geophysicist at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and has presented research at a major geophysical conference implying that the slip-sliding geologic plates that cover the Earth, the tectonic plates, might once have moved thousands of times faster than they do today. Now, what does that mean? If true, that would cram lots more geological change into less time and would permit a view then of creation that would be within a 6-day period and therefore compatible with the biblical statement. Now, this is a respected scientist. Now, on the other hand, how do we know what has happened to time in the billions of years? So we need to be reminded that scientists are only human, and that a powerful ideology, be it creationism or capitalism or anything else, can shape some scientists' conclusions as strongly as any empirical evidence. This leads directly into, or supports directly, what I was trying to say. Is the Theosophical worldview, are the ideas a kind of covering over deeply held convictions and beliefs? I've often thought that sometimes we have very good Baptist theosophists and very good Hindu theosophists and very good Buddhist theosophists and so on. We have very good Presbyterian theosophists. That is to say that long-held, deeply held convictions are present, and the theosophical ideas often sort of cover them over or are interpreted in that way so that they are understood from that kind of background rather than on their own. So we have to be alert to that. And I think it supports my proposal that we need to really look at these ideas that shape our lives. Are they ideas that have shaped them in some way, and we stay with those ideas forever? Or are we shape shifters all the time? Because change is inevitable. Have we ever rethought, from the time we heard about the law of karma, for example? We're going to talk about this on Thursday, I think, in terms of lawfulness. Have we ever thought of changing our view of the law of karma? Where we so glibly say it's the law of action and reaction, cause and effect. Is it? What if there is no causality? That things are as they are at the moment. We'll look at some of this. So, but we hesitate to change our minds. And yet, Theosophy encourages us, above all, to inquire, to probe, to look deeply, to constantly examine our ideas. Well, before going further, let me turn to another story, this time based on an article in an issue a few years ago of the Smithsonian magazine. The study of human cultures was dealt with in the last part of the 19th century in comparison with today's method of study. Now, at the 1893 Columbian Exposition here in Chicago, there were, probably for the first time, living ethnological displays of peoples and cultures which the organizers spoke of and thought of and publicized. Now, to quote the Smithsonian magazine, less inspiring were the ways in which people and their cultures were depicted at the exposition. In retrospect, the framework for the living exhibitions was an oversimplified evolutionary one. It categorized cultures in racial terms, separating the so-called primitive from the civilized, and drew unwarranted conclusions about moral and material progress and superiority. Some of our literature still reflects this. So let's not feel that we have, we're so superior about this. People were spoken about and displayed as if they were specimens of a type without a voice of their own. And certainly living in Australia, I learned this very directly, immediately, in my studies of and contacts with some of the indigenous peoples. The article continues, "We have come a long way in our human studies. We have learned that the human subjects have a contribution to make based on their own knowledge and insights. Ethnologists have, over the past generation, encouraged studies of folk knowledge, ethnoscience, and indigenous systems of classification and cultural and artistic expression." Again, as this story illustrates, how we view the world influences how we perceive other cultures and peoples, how we categorize. We could go on citing examples, including references to the changes in the scientific paradigm. It's fairly well established today, for example, that it's impossible to maintain a completely objective stance in examining anything, whether it be a subatomic particle or a human culture. The very act of perception, what you see is what you beget. The very act of perception influences, may change, alter, modify what is being observed. We live in a participatory universe. And so the emergence in recent years of a theory known as the anthropic principle, not acceptable to many scientists, has brought attention to the idea, long a part of the theosophical worldview, that consciousness or intelligence is primary. Stated in a very simplistic way, the anthropic principle suggests that the universe has the properties it has, properties that we observe. If its earlier properties had been much different, we wouldn't be here to observe it. Just a fraction of difference, and we wouldn't be here. Let me quote a statement by one exponent of the anthropic principle, Brandon Carter of Cambridge University. "What we can expect to observe must be restricted by the conditions necessary for our presence as observers. And so, although our situation is not necessarily central, it is inevitably privileged to some extent." So we have to consider all of this. We have to see that the observer is as essential to the universe as the universe is to the observer. What you see is what you beget. In his remarkable study of understanding the ideas that have shaped our worldview, Richard Tarnas, this marvelous book, The Passion of the Western Mind, has pointed out that we can recognize a multiplicity of archetypal sequences with each scientific revolution, each change of worldview. Yet perhaps we can also recognize one overall archetypal dialectic in the evolution of human consciousness that subsumes all of these smaller sequences. And so we can better understand this journey of the Western mind from the birth of philosophy out of the mythological consciousness in ancient Greece through the classical, medieval, and modern eras to our own postmodern age. But this movement from one worldview to another, and to what extent have we changed our worldview? Christopher Bache has pointed out in a remarkable book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, which I highly recommend. The crux of our crisis of knowing is that we're trapped within our minds, and our minds appear to be hopelessly embedded in layers of arbitrary historical and cultural distortions. We're embedded in these things. Our minds we've been trained. We've been trained, for example, in a linear way of thinking, haven't we? So definitely trained in that. Past, present, and future on a linear scale. We're accustomed to this. And we don't realize the extent to which it has influenced our views, even of reincarnation. But perhaps there's another way of looking at reincarnation. I'm going to suggest some of that. And then the factor which I think I want to spend a little time on, this factor of language, because language is a function of consciousness, at least so I think, and the ideas we hold are most often expressed in language, whether as words, written or spoken, or as symbols, which words really are in essence. Words are symbols too. And in most of our languages, our dual way of thinking is perpetuated. There's a kind of reciprocity. Our language shapes our ideas, and our ideas often shape our language. There's a wonderful work by the biologist, Dr. Elizabeth Sartoris, Gaia, The Human Journey from Chaos to Cosmos. And she has written that written language may have been the invention that changed our mental images of ourselves and our world more than any other. Amazing. Well, consider. She says, remember that the reality we humans see as ourselves and our relationship to the world around us, our reality is our creation, our conscious imagery. What you see is what you beget. And our theosophical worldview is rich in imagery, and it's imagery that makes language possible. The meaning we give to things comes from the context in which we see them. And we supply this context from the sense impressions that reach us, and from the patterns that are evolving within our own nervous system. Patterns which reveal themselves in that self-organizing and partly conscious mind, because the mind is only partly conscious. And we so often artificially divide the mind. We have a higher mind and a lower mind, which is so stupid. We have one mind. We have one mind. Manas is one, if you like. It may function in a variety of ways, but there's nothing higher and lower. Oh, that was my lower mind. It got in the way. Somehow got in the way of my higher mind. Well, and so I stumbled over it, and so on. It's a nice scapegoat. But at any one moment, there is only one mind operative. How you think is at the moment the mind that you are using. It's again through our language that we very often work to build out of the patterns that we see what we think of. What we see is what we beget. And we're continually at work in making conscious, thoughtful sense of the patterns that are before us. We embed all new information into existing brain-mind patterns. And HPB in her, you thought I'd forgotten HPB. Never. In her class, according to her student, Commander Robert Bowen, some of you are familiar with the Bowen Notes on how to study Theosophy, or that's the name that was given them, but actually notes on her class in the Secret Doctrine. And he points out, he says, I suggest that that the study of the Secret Doctrine is a mental exercise which must be exceedingly fatiguing. Well, I guess some people do find it fatiguing, but it's exciting. It's the most exciting book in our literature. The characters are fantastic. You've got Jnani Buddhas and Petris and solar laws, and you've got the whole works. And talk about shapeshifters. There they are in their fullness, and driven around by the greatest of the shapeshifters of all, my dear friend Fohat. But anyway, a kind of fatiguing exercise. And HPB smiled and nodded, he said. One must not be a fool, she said, and drive oneself into the madhouse by attempting too much at first. Now, speaking of this fact that every time new information reaches us, we embed it into existing brain-mind patterns. And we put these patterns into categories or contexts of meaning. We add to them, we change them, we rearrange and distort them until we feel they're part of our overall worldview. Now, what does HPB say to her students? She says, the brain is the instrument of waking consciousness, and every conscious mental picture formed means change and destruction of the atoms of the brain. But we don't like to give up any of those old brain patterns. Oh, they are so dear to us. And so we put the new information into the old brain patterns. But she says, ordinary intellectual activity moves on well-beaten paths in the brain. That's what I'm just saying. And does not compel sudden adjustments and destructions in its substance. But this new kind of mental effort calls for something very different. And this is what the Theosophist ought to be doing. The carving out, she says, of new brain paths, the ranking in different order of the little brain lives. Do we take that to heart? That's what she says. Anyway, so our contemporary scientific worldview evolved in European languages, and it's really our language structure that shapes our worldview. We think and speak in terms of thing nouns and action verbs. We know that there are many human languages that are process-oriented, so that the world is seen not as composed of separate things in space, but as interwoven processes in time. Einstein once agreed it would be easier to describe the discoveries of modern physics in the Hopi language than in English, because Hopi has single-word expressions for such statements as the light shines and the water falls, expressions that do not separate the light from its shining and water from its falling. Process language, in other words. But process languages are better suited to organic rather than to mechanical worldviews. Try thinking of theosophy as a verb. It's not a thing. I know HPB even called it a thing. But I think in her language, in the late Victorian period, that was inevitable. And that's true in much of the secret doctrine. But get your characters to move. Fohat moves. So did the Dhyani Buddhists. So did the Yan Chohans. So do all the others, the Manasaputras. I love the names of them, you know. They're wonderful names, aren't they? And they're all characters. They move. But we are inclined, even in our statement of the theosophical worldview, to use static, mechanistic language rather than process language. So it may seem far removed from our thesis and from the exploration of theosophical ideas, but when I use that word, the world, therefore, the ideas that shape our lives, the ideas that shape our world, what do we mean by that term? And it's very interesting what HPB herself said is the meaning of the term world. And remember, she was speaking of this before the development of quantum physics and all of the various aspects of the contemporary scientific worldview. And she was asked, and it's exactly what I've tried to interpret as what you see is what you beget. She said, the world means man living in the personal nature. The world is you living in your personal nature. This world, she says, will find in the 2 volumes of the Secret Doctrine all its utmost comprehension can grasp, but no more. But this was not to say that the disciple who is not living in the world cannot find any more in the book than the world finds. Every form, no matter how crude, contains the image of its creator concealed within it. That's why I say she's the most modern of our writers. And if she had had processed language, I think she would have used it. Well, my time is nearly up, and I just want to indicate what we're going to take up. So what I want to do tomorrow is look at the great idea we call unity, but I'm going to suggest it's unity-polarity. And for that, we need to understand the great idea which we can only call periodicity. And for that, we have to understand the major idea of lawfulness, which ultimately leads, always the 4th is the central point of transition. In any series of 7, of course, the 4th is the wholeness. Jung, you know, Carl Jung used the number 4 is the point of transition, the point of wholeness. The threefold must find their resolution in a fourfold, and so this is transformation. So if on Friday we get that far, we'll look at that. But that is the progression that I suggest as a process through which we can explore what impact these ideas have had.
The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
Yesterday, in concluding, I suggested that today we would look at the great idea of which I had been calling for some time, unity-polarity, but I've long since given up those words. They are not the right words. Now, I'm not sure, I'm still struggling because, as I said yesterday, language is wonderful. Words are wonderful. They open out into all kinds of understandings and insights, and they're beautiful. At the same time, they can sometimes limit us. And so I think we need to begin to discover, in one sense, a new language. So from one point of view, what I'm suggesting as the great idea that we may explore today is this process. As I said yesterday, I think we need to consider Theosophy as a verb. It's a process in which we're involved. And it's a process that is a movement from chaos to cosmos. Perhaps those are better words. We'll see as we go along this morning. I suggested also yesterday in closing that HVB defined world. We each of us live in our own world. I had on the board, what you see is what you beget. We beget our own world. And she defined world as man living in the personal nature. So this symbol of ultimate reality, oneness, the absoluteness, if you like, is reflected in that realm in which we are moving, in which the space of our own beingness is present. Fritz Kuntz used to say that we are the test object of the whole universe. He used that phrase. And in that sense we are. We're also the reflection. So in looking at this, we have to recognize a statement that HPB made, a couple of statements that she made, that may help us to understand what I'm trying to get at. In The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, page 130, HPB points out that in occult metaphysics, there are, properly speaking, two ones. The one on the unreachable plane of absoluteness and infinity, on which no speculation is possible. Of course, HPB spends much of her time speculating on it, therefore, you know, and I suppose we do also. And the second one on the plane of emanations. The former, that is, the first one on the unreachable plane of absoluteness, can neither emanate nor be divided, as it is eternal, absolute, and immutable. The second, being, so to speak, the reflection of the first one, for it is the logos, or Ishvara, in the universe of illusion, can do all this. Earlier, on page 110 of Volume 1, she has said that from the unknown one, the infinite totality, the manifested one, or the periodical manvantaric deity, emanates. And this is the universal mind, which, separated from its fountain source, is the demiurgos, or the creative logos of the Western Kabbalists and the four-faced Brahma of the Hindu religion. Now, she uses three very interesting terms. And then I'd like to suggest that I think she would have been as excited as we ought to be with the new science of chaos. Now, we think of chaos as disorder and confusion, but it isn't. Again, the word chaos is actually became our English word yawn, to yawn. It's the abyss, it's the yawning in which everything is possible. And so every time you yawn, you create this movement which reveals what I think of as the power of limits. That is to say, your mouth can open only so wide, so to speak, and always circular, if you've noticed that. And so go ahead and yawn. And what happens? Every articulation is possible, you see. There is breath, which is, of course, that eternal motion, which is breath. HPB calls it the great breath, doesn't she? And so then you use all of the factors of articulation to produce logos, the word, to produce that which will be limited, that which is manifested then, which is a reflection. So if we can put absoluteness, she uses the term radiation, which is a kind of continuous to a singularity, as it were, which is a reflection, which, like chaos then, is indeed chaos. And I've drawn it in that manner because this is, in one sense, what we may call not the perfect circle, as we will see in a moment, but is indeed the pattern which emerges as the reflection of this radiation, which is all within it. And of course, on a board, you can't put it all within it because it's like trying to write on top of writing on top of writing. But from this, then, proceeds, she says, emanation, which we make into, from this chaos, into, then, and I'm putting it outside, which it all belongs inside, as we'll see, into cosmos, which is in itself also a wonderful word, which is the ordering principle which is present within chaos. Cosmos we have in our wonderful word cosmetic, of course. It's an appearance. And so we call all of this reflection, what do we call it? Maya, or HPB calls it Maya, which is the measurability of it, from the root ma, to measure, which we have in manas, and so, and in other words also. But the measurability is always in an inexact proportion. HPB gives this, if you want to look it up, in, I think it's Shloka 3 of stanza 4 of the Secret Doctrine. So you can find that very easily, in which she says in this great opening, then, she first uses it as number, which of course Pythagoras realized as sacred number, not quantity, but quality, the whole thing, and then gives it as the archetypal patterns which are there. The 3, the 1, the 4, the 1, the 5. You remember that? This, of course, gives us that marvelous term pi, you remember, which is always the inexactness, which is why this is inexact. That inexactness is the unsatisfactoriness. This becomes the first noble truth of the Buddha, if you like, that all is misery. Well, as I've often said, any peasant in India toiling in the hot sun of India plowing his field could have told you that life is misery. You don't have to sit under a bow tree and meditate to discover this profound truth. But what is the profound truth? The profound truth is the inexactness, the unsatisfactory condition, because it is, in that sense, always inexact. Now, to come back then a little bit, nothing in the manifested world is separate because it is one. HPB, in her talks with her students, she said, according to Robert Bowen, no matter what one may study in the Secret Doctrine, let the mind hold fast at the basis of its ideation to the following ideas. And the very first one she gives, the fundamental unity of all existence. A living thing, a thing altogether different from the common notion of unity, which is why I said I'm abandoning the word unity. We can feel unity, yes, feel harmony, feel that resonance that takes place. One can see this in terms of sound, incidentally, in that resonance that is always there, that as we chanted the Om this morning, for example, and there have been a number of experiments with this. To ask a group of people, for example, this is one of them, to ask a group of people, each of you, by yourself, to find that tone that is really most congenial to you, and just begin to chant it, just begin to sound it. Some will be high, some will be low, and it will really be a kind of cacophony of sound. But what happens is, and this is part of chaos theory, is that as those variety of tones are hummed or chanted, however you want to put it, something begins to bring about a harmony, a kind of unseen pattern begins to develop. This has been tried with numerous groups of people, that pretty soon you begin to bring your tone into harmony with the tone of the person next to you, or around you, behind you, and pretty soon one has this harmonious tone. And so, as she says, existence is one thing, not any collection of things linked together. And so, in one sense, this is what I've decided to call, after the title of a wonderful book on chaos theory, this then is the turbulent mirror. And only because it is a mirror, it is Maya, it is illusory, it is not there in one sense, it's the whole, if we like. This is with the W, and this is the whole in the ozone layer of absoluteness. How do you like that? Just thought of that. But it's the whole. It's the no-thingness. In other words, it's the no. The Buddhist calls it the sunyata, the shunyata, the no-thingness. But yet we think of it as a thing. So it's turbulent because it is forever changing, forever in motion. And if you want a very good book, which I have delighted in, by the same authors, John Briggs, who's a professor of English and journalism, and David Peat, who's Dr. David Peat, who is a physicist from the University of Liverpool. And they're the authors of the book Turbulent Mirror, which sets forth the whole chaos theory. And I can't think of how excited, I can't help but think of how excited HPB would have been if chaos theory had been around when she was writing The Secret Doctrine. She would have had quite a language for many of the things she was trying to express. She would have, I think, really been excited. And if you want something much easier, 7 Lessons of Chaos, Spiritual Wisdom from the Science of Change, again by Briggs and Peat. And as they point out, the scientific term chaos refers to an underlying interconnectedness that exists in apparently random events. It focuses on hidden patterns, nuances, the sensitivity of things, and the rules for how the unpredictable leads to the new, because it does lead to creativity. In looking at this turbulent mirror, then, we have these terms: radiation, which HPB uses, reflection. This is a reflection. It's as though, for the moment, the radiating rays of absoluteness come to a focus, and in that focus develop around it a kind of form to which we give the term the manifested universe. From that then emanates all that is present. And in response to a question that HPB was asked at one of her classes, she defined the difference between the two terms radiation and emanation. She said, the two terms express to my mind, that's to HPB's mind, two entirely different ideas, and are the best apologies for the original terms that could be found. But if the ordinary meanings are attached to them, the idea will be missed. Radiation, she says, is, so to say, the unconscious and spontaneous shooting forth, the action of a something from which this act takes place. And you can feel her struggle for words in her answers to the questions that she was posed. And that's why I say I think she would have been excited with things, many of the ideas from quantum physics, non-locality, for example, and from chaos theory, and that's why this is a turbulent mirror. That's what we live in, and we ourselves are reflections of that, because the world is ourselves living in our own nature. This constant changing, this mirror reflection, which is always shaking, which is always, turbulent in that sense. It is unsatisfactory, never exact. And this is why in all of our relationships, because everything within this turbulent mirror of the universe is relational now, isn't it? Everything is in relation. We are all the time, and this, of course, is part of chaos theory, because whatever happens, this is what's known as the butterfly theory, butterfly aspect, that the wings of a butterfly flutter here in Wheaton, and the weather patterns in Tokyo may change. We know this now through the resonance of the universe, through the fact that everything is interlinked, interconnected. And so always, whatever we do, whatever we think at whatever level, because this is also, this turbulent mirror, is manas, is consciousness from the universal mind, the reflection of the patterns in the universal mind, but none exact. But what happens is that we want to hold them. And so the second noble truth, this arises out of desire, out of the holding on, the wanting it to be there. And in every relationship, there is this desire, this wanting to hold it, to stay the way you are, Don't change. You're perfect the way you are. Well, change is inevitable because this is turbulent. And this is the whole basis of creativity. The lawfulness we call karma, because karma and creativity are the same. If there were not this lawfulness, there could not be the emanation of the new, the creative, the constantly changing, the shape-shifting of the whole universe. So she goes on. But emanation is something from which another thing issues in a constant efflux, she says, and emanates consciously. This is why in talking of the first fundamental proposition, she speaks of it as unconditioned unconsciousness, which might just as well be unconditioned consciousness. Something that only in its reflection, only in us, is again, we are all turbulent mirrors in ourselves, reflecting all of this. And so this gives us the creativity, but most of us emanate unconsciously. But we are all the time sending out thoughts, desires, emotions, and even physically. And so she says, an orthodox occultist goes so far as to say that the smell of a flower emanates from it consciously, absurd as it may seem to the profane. So she goes on, radiation can come from the absolute. Emanation cannot. This is why it's only out of the radiation, out of that original patternless, that now patterns begin to form. Symbols begin to form. Words begin to be articulated. We begin to articulate the whole universe. And this, of course, in one of the great traditions, in the Kashmiri Shaivite tradition in India, the descent is traced in Hindu philosophy from that original sound, nada, conscious and unconscious. And so from the creative principle, the absoluteness without any attributes, arises that which utters expression. And God said, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word as an articulation, logos is both word and order. We translate it as word, but logos is order, is design. And yet a design that is never exact. Consider the fact that every snowflake is different, and yet all of them, if you were to draw a snowflake, it would have 6 sides, wouldn't it? It's a hexagon, 6 being, incidentally, the perfect number. But I won't go into that. I just throw things out at you and then begin to think about these things. So when we say we're a 7-principled being, no. We're a 1-principled being, only 1 principle, from which emanate in a beautiful, orderly system all of those aspects of that principle, which, for lack of better terms, we call principles. Yes, an HPB did, but if there is only one whole, W-H-O-L-E, out of which the wholeness and holiness, the exchange, which is what the Bhagavad Gita is all about, this sacrifice, this exchange that is forever taking place, this interconnectedness. And so she says, one difference exists in the idea that radiation is sure sooner or later to be withdrawn again. Isn't that what we have in this cyclic movement of pralaya and manvantara? And we love these words, of course. I do too. But into that laya center, that no-thing center, that 0 point, which is the laya or pralaya, while emanation runs into other emanations, a constant movement, but never exact. And so, of course, we go on that there is a way, says the Buddha in the great 4 Noble Truths, the 3rd Noble Truth, there is a way to let go of this clinging, this grasping, this attaching, this holding on to things. This is my chair, you see, because it is my chair and I hold on to it. And so there is a way, and that way is, of course, begins with samadhi, right insight, right knowing, right belief. It's usually translated right belief, but it's seeing through this. Seeing through, because what you see is what you beget. I come back to those words I put up there yesterday. I'm told that the whole process in Tibetan is just in a word of 3 letters, C-H-O, cho, which simply means to straighten out yourself. Get yourself straight. See not through all of this mirror, but see straightly, as it were. And so she goes on. Emanation runs into other emanation and is thoroughly separated and differentiated. And here we are at the complete separation, differentiation point, you see. She says, of course, at the end of the cycle of time, emanation will also be withdrawn into the one absolute. But meanwhile, during the entire cycle of changes, emanation will persist. One thing emanates from the other, and in fact, from one point of view, emanation is equivalent to evolution. So from one point of view, then, we should not be talking about evolution, but emanation. This constant emanation that is always there, never exact, always in this unsatisfactory state. but we can straighten ourselves out. And this is, of course, the Noble Eightfold Path. This is the whole ethics of Theosophy, as it's the ethics of Buddhism. And so she says, while radiation represents to my mind, to HPB's mind, in the pre-cosmic period, of course, an instantaneous action, like that of a piece of paper set on fire under a burning glass, of which act the sun knows nothing. This is why I was saying it just is. It's the isness. Both terms, she says, of course, are used for want of better. Again, you feel her struggle for language. I think there's so much in that statement of HPB's in answer to one of her students for us to consider that we really need to examine it very carefully. And I've tried, in one sense, to take it apart, to show you that it's the same thing that we find in the great revelation of the Buddha. It's present in Christianity. One could look at this in terms of the whole Gospel of John, for example, which is, of course, the most Gnostic of the Gospels and the most mystical of the Gospels, as you know. And it really leads us into this whole depth of understanding. There is then always at this stage relationship. A relationship that is never fully harmonious, but in which we can enter into this creative process, and which provides us with the freedom then to always push the limits, because it is, in one sense, out of this turbulent mirror comes a kind of self-limiting aspect. And so within every universe, within every world, and this is our own self-limiting world, ourselves living in our personal nature, we self-limit and we push against the boundaries. And when we break through, which is, of course, the whole process of yoga, isn't it? But it's always that process of breaking through. But self-organizes again around new centers, but always in relationship, and always open then to that constant flow of energy and matter. You know, I become aware of this because sometimes people say to me, don't you get tired? Of course one gets tired lecturing. One gets exhausted at one time. But in the very process, because of the openness, during the talk, I am never exhausted. I have never yet experienced exhaustion during the talk. But there is this openness that brings this ceaseless energy, because it is a system that is open. And HPB says this, that emanation is a constant efflux. Isn't that marvelous? That's why it has to be the HOLE, the no thingness. But once you have closed into the thingness, once you have held on, this chair is mine because it's a comfortable chair. Well, that's an absolutely nonsensical statement. There is no such thing as a comfortable chair. A chair is a chair. You are either comfortable or uncomfortable. The chair is perfectly... How can you say this is a comfortable chair? But this is what we do all the time. We apply categories in a wrong way. And so we say, you have annoyed me. Joe, how could you do that? You have annoyed me. Joe has done nothing. He has been himself open to a flow which somehow I was unable to mesh with my flow. And so I always attribute, and this is why in this turbulent universe, this turbulent mirror, we are all the time looking at our own reflection. The word mirror is perfect for this. It's a turbulent mirror in which we see ourselves again and again and again and again, and attribute to that image the things we like or we don't like. And so we say, Tim, don't ever change. You're just right as you are. But of course you will change. The image changes all the time. And new ideas, and there's a new influx. And this is what we're dealing with. This is the idea which, once you grasp this, that we're all cut out of the same fabric. If you want to call it akasha, call it akasha. Well, HPB does, so you might as well. You know, that which is illumined from within. Akasha, the original meaning was sky, the sky god, and so on. But it has the meaning of illumination, illumined from within. And we're all cut out of that same fabric. Different sizes and shapes, and we don't like our shape, you know, we say, because it's never exactly what we want. It's never exactly. The relationship, the interconnectedness is never precisely what we want. And yet, there is a harmony and a beauty. One of the wonderful things in the whole chaos theory is aesthetic dimension. This whole sense of the goodness, the truthfulness of things as they are. This is why Plato pointed to beauty and harmony as the manner in which we could come into an understanding of truth. And knowing the truth, said Plato, we will do the good. Seeing the right proportion of things, seeing the rightness of all that is in this interconnectedness. The tree is just right. And yet no two trees are exactly alike. But the tree in its own essence is its own rightness, its own right proportion. And that is beauty. That is the harmony. And seeing that is the truthfulness, the dharma, its own essential nature. And so seeing that, we do the good. This is what Plato said. And so we find it there in the chaos theory. And of course, this is all was discovered through what is known as the fractals, which are the irregular numbers, the non-linear numbers, but we love to live in a linear universe where we count each other off, you know. How we react to each other, you say. We say, but you did something I didn't expect. Why did you say that? Why did you do that? But this is the unpredictability to the open system, which is there, the creative possibility, the creative potential. And so this fractal aesthetic, which has the rich ambiguities of metaphorical connections, if you like. So it's always present. It's a rough measure of how complex it is, the intricacy of its details. And so this new mathematics, if you like, the fractals. So as they point out, chaos theory shows us that it's an illusion to separate the self from the other, and that can be equally illusory to imagine a false or inauthentic merging of the self with the other. So there is the gap between, and this is what the fractal mathematics is dealing with often, is the gap between regular numbers, which gives us what they call the irregular numbers. And it's that gap between. And so within this turbulent mirror, it's a kind of endless diversity. And yet when we hold on at any point, we forget that we're all cut of the same fabric. We're all cut from that original no-thingness of space, akasha, mula prakriti, the self-beingness and self-becomingness, svabhavat. HPB uses these terms, and they're nice terms to use, but that self-becomingness, we're all cut of that same fabric. And yet, in our being then, we are unique and yet one. Unique in the manner in which we articulate our particular wholeness. We articulate it uniquely and therefore interconnect at all points. And this, I think, is what HPB was telling us at every stage of the way, from gods to men, as she said, from worlds to atoms, from a star to a rushlight, from the sun to the vital heat of the meanest being. The world of form and existence is an immense chain whose links are all connected. The law of analogy is the first key to the world problem. And these links have to be studied, she said, coordinately in their occult relations to each other. So this is the tremendous idea that can change our whole perspective, change our lives from within out, change because our whole consciousness, because now we have that right view, samaditi, right view of things. This, I think, is the most life-changing, the most creative possibility. We live in a turbulent mirror. What you see is what you beget.
The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
Well then, good morning all.
Good morning.
Yesterday we talked about the great idea, which I had originally called unity to polarity, but it's the one to manyness, it's chaos into cosmos, it's this process which HPB clearly calls radiation, reflection, emanation. However you want to put it. There's probably no one here who wasn't struck in some way or another when the concept of reincarnation was presented. Perhaps immediately a rebellion, perhaps immediately an acceptance, perhaps an immediate query, what's that all about, and so on. And of course, underlying that, as we know, is this great idea of cycles, of periodicity. But I'd like to examine it in perhaps a little different way today than we usually think of it. Mainly because I think we get very simplistic in the sense that we do not really probe behind to see what really is it that reincarnates, first of all, and is that the whole story? I was going to begin this morning by talking about asteroids, but then I thought, well, that might confuse you all, but then on the other hand, it's rather interesting. Now, the point of talking about asteroids at all is the fact that for many years, scientists thought these were random, and there are many astrophysicists who still say they are random. But there is a suggestion that there's a periodic increase in cratering, That is to say, the suggestion that there's a periodicity of epochs when a significant portion of all species on the planet are extinguished, similar to the fact that 65 million years ago the dinosaurs disappeared, and so on. Now, this is periodicity on a very large scale, isn't it? A tremendously large scale. A periodicity that is not absolutely predictable, and so is frequently called random. Now, as this comes down to our own lives, we begin to recognize that there is this lawfulness, this great idea which really shapes our lives in a tremendous way and has had a tremendous impact on our lives, the concept that of a renewal, of a destruction and a renewal, of death and rebirth, not always predictable in terms of specifics, and therefore chaotic, if one wants to put it that way, and yet predictable in terms of a periodicity that occurs. Now, there are certain phrases in both the second and third fundamental proposition that bear on this that I think we need to examine to see how this also can not just shape our lives, but perhaps more finely attune our lives. Because one must extrapolate from the universal to the particular in this sense that we need to see how we can live in a system which is in itself undergoing constant change, because we are undergoing constant change. It's interesting, in the second fundamental proposition, I think we often overlook the fact that it speaks of the eternity of the universe in toto, as a whole, that is, in toto, in its completeness, in its wholeness. Periodically, the playground. Now, that's an interesting term, the playground of numberless universes. So, within this whole system that we illustrated in a very rough way, within this are numberless universes, says HPB, a playground. Now, there are, in Hindu mythology, the whole creative process is sometimes referred to as lila, a play. It's a play of the gods. It's a delight. It's a joyous bursting forth. And so it's this play where we enjoy the whole process of experience, of numberless universes incessantly manifesting and disappearing. So just as planets, as asteroids hit planets, as stars are continually being born and disappearing, so is the human being. But what is the human being? What is that identity? And this is the central question that, in one sense, we need to come to. I think we can begin to recognize, first of all, that with this introduction of a manifested universe, a playground, time has come into being. Time has now come in. Time is really a human invention, as you know. HPB speaks of it as an illusion produced by the succession of our states of consciousness as we travel through eternal duration. And it does not exist where no consciousness exists in which the illusion can be produced. I've often quoted the astrophysicist Dr. John Wheeler, whose statement I think is the best about it, that time is a human invention, and therefore if there are flaws in it, it's our own fault. So we have to begin to understand what are these experiences of time. HPB speaks of this in the third fundamental proposition, through the cycle of incarnation or necessity, in accordance with cyclic and karmic law. This obligatory pilgrimage. Now, the word necessity, I think, is again a very interesting word, and it has to do partly with time, which is why I'm bringing it out at this point, because the word comes from nexus, or necto, the Latin necto, I bind, to bind. And so we are bound within this. And if this is our world, ourselves acting in our personal nature, then this is the universe, but by reflection, the macrocosm reflecting in the microcosm, it's our world. We are bound in it. And the whole process then is to go through this, an unbinding process, if I can put it that way. You may remember that this Western idea of necessity has its roots in, of course, Greek images of 4 goddesses, the first of whom was Ananke, who was the goddess of necessity, the goddess that binds us, that which holds us. It's interesting that in some of HPB's works and in the Vedanta philosophy, the term is used for the successive, what we might call domains of our being, upadhi. So that, as I suggested yesterday, there is one principle, but there are sheaths. There are those aspects which hold it. And the upadhi, which comes from di, which is that which holds, that which nourishes, that which gives form to it. And often the analogy or the metaphor is used in the Upanishads of the clay pot. The clay is one. But what makes it a pot is the emptiness, the no-thingness, which is the breath, which is Atman, which is the breath. And so because this then is held, we are held within this form, which then is the binding quality in which we have bound ourselves until we begin the unbinding quality. Because the Mahatmas point out in the Mahatma letters, they speak of the question of identity between the old man and the new ego, in quotes, and point out that this is a constant shifting, but in time, of course. So, by necessity, but among the Greek gods then associated with time are 2 that are particularly interesting to us in this whole process. The process in which we are bound within our personal nature, in which there are all these ups and downs, these ripples in our biological life. We are bound in it, and so we are bound by Chronos, the god Chronos, which of course gives us chronology and clock time and all the rest of it, you see. And we say we're bound by it. I'm X number of years. I've been around for X number of years, and my prediction is I have an X number of years. But again, like the asteroids, predictable that there will be an end, unpredictable when the end will come. This, of course, was the whole philosophy of Tsongkhapa, the great Buddhist reformer to whom HPB refers again and again, who said, that's why, therefore, one needs to consider and face one's death, because it could come at any moment. But death is certain, the time of it is uncertain. So therefore, contemplate one's endings, which is chronos. We love to say, my last incarnation, or my next incarnation, as though this were a linear thing in time. And that's why I'm making it in this form, because it is not linear. And I think we need to get away from this linearity. If we talk about cycles, and then we draw straight lines, what's a cycle if you're drawing straight lines? But in the Greek philosophy was another God. And we see that at any moment, and I've left it open here at the top only for purposes of illustration, but it could come at any moment, there is the entry of the God Kairos. This momentness, the absolute uniqueness of a moment of enlightenment. It's the moment one comes awake. One is either asleep, which most of us are, as Arthur Kessler called us sleepwalkers, because we really are not awake to the trueness of ourselves. But at any moment, there can come another domain and another domain. So that if then this domain begins to come further and further down, we are less and less bound. I would like to just interject at this point, and we'll come back to the Mahatma letters, that sometimes we think of the Mahatmas as perfected beings. They are on their way. As long as they take physical incarnation, they are subject to the laws of physicality. And they do have certain desires, preferences. They make that clear. We are adepts only when acting as such, they say in the letters. They are a step ahead of us, but they are part of our human life wave, according to HPB. And according to HPB, therefore, every step on the spiritual path has to be taken in physical incarnation, in a physical vehicle, subject then to this binding quality, but yet bound and yet unbound, if I can put it that way. Bound and yet unbound. Personal and yet impersonal. So let's not suddenly put them at some level of the bodhisattvas, the celestial bodhisattvas, or the Buddhas, or the Christs, but at a level where they are closer to us in that sense, and yet far wiser than we are, and helping us, certainly, as we must help those coming on. So as this moves down, begins to cover this, as it were, this, of course, is the whole process of development, spiritual development. So within that, as Master Cage says, and this is, of course, the Tibetan teaching, it is the group of skandhas that form and constitute the physical and mental individuality we call man or any being. And this, I think, is an extremely important aspect in this understanding of the cycles. These are then what binds us are the skandhas, or what we can call the elements that hold us together. Now, it is these, it is suggested, that reincarnate. When we use the term reincarnate, What we mean by it is coming into flesh again. Isn't that right? That's all it means. And there's several different processes that we need to look at that are all part of the cyclic unfoldment, the cyclic development, the law of periodicity, the law of cyclicity, the law of rhythmicity. So there is a rhythm, not always predictable, as I say, like with the asteroids, and yet periodic enough that it has its own rhythm. And each one of us has our own rhythm, isn't that right? Some people like to get up in the morning, and some people hate those people who like to get up in the morning. Some people never want to go to bed. Maybe they're afraid of never waking up again. You know, I think it'd be delightful. So I'm all ready for the adventure. I think the adventure is going to be absolutely exciting on the other side. And some people are afraid of that adventure, you know. But that's the excitement of Kairos, the moment that opens into a whole new adventure. So the skandhas, of course, are simply these things that bind us, these attributes, these fibers that sort of hold us together. I'm talking about this because it comes back to the question, what is it that reincarnates? And what is it that reincarnates is simply these habit patterns. These are patterns. 5 exoterically, as the Mahatma points out, rupa, the material properties or attributes, the sensations, abstract ideas, the tendencies, both physical and mental, the mental powers, mental, physical, and moral predispositions, which go on and on and on, which are repetitive. And so, therefore, very often, and this is what is happening all the time within us, is a kind of repetition, so that we are constantly reincarnating. And at that particular level, then, we call transmigration. Oh, horrors, we don't believe in transmigration. Well, you better, because it's happening all the time. I don't care whether you believe in it or not. It's like saying I don't believe that the earth goes around the sun. The fact of the matter is we sit in each other's protoplasmic soup, you know, constantly. And we're constantly in exchange. If you don't believe in it, read HPB. It's in the collected writings. Marvelous article called The Transmigration of Life Atoms. Now, I know she used the word atom, and today we wouldn't use it. But it's the transmigration of life energy congealed into form as cellular structures. How do you like that? So it's that constant movement within us. It's said, for example, that the lining of the esophagus, if I remember correctly, is renewed every 24 hours. So you don't have the lining of your esophagus that you had yesterday, if 24 hours have passed, you see. And one of the things that some scientists are probing, whether there is a kind of master clock that coordinates and then sometimes fails to coordinate the time cycles, the biological cycles of the various organs of the body. Then we say we have dis-ease. We're not at ease with ourselves, and so on. So this is going on all the time, this transmigration. And it's a sharing, because everything is shared. This is one of the fundamental laws that we need to really take into ourselves, and I think it makes such a difference in understanding. It's the law of exchange. In the Bhagavad Gita, it's yajna, which is the law of sacrifice. That something dies that something else may live. So there is that constant renewal at the physical level, which is transmigration. And then within a domain, if you like, which is just beyond here, the whole domain which we can call the psyche, the psychic domain, which reaches into the mental, monastic, and down into the physical. Here is where, of course, this whole process of the continuity, the reorganization of the skandhas, if you like, take place. This is, of course, reincarnation then. But that isn't the end of the story, and HPB is very clear about that in the third fundamental proposition, in a marvelous statement when she says, the pivotal doctrine of the esoteric philosophy. Well, then I always think, well, time to wake up, Joy, and look at it a little more closely. And so she says, the pivotal doctrine admits no privileges or special gifts in man, save those won by his own ego through personal effort and merit. Throughout a long series, time, yes, but what kind of time? In this level, it's the biological clock time, biological time, which is different for every individual. But now there are other kinds of time. Throughout a long series of metempsychoses and reincarnations. So notice what she puts first. In fact, the Mahatma goes on to say, returning to the question of identity between the old man and the new ego, a man of any given age, while sentiently the same, is yet physically not the same as he was a few years earlier. Buddhistically speaking, his skandhas have changed. So, as the Mahatma says, at the same time they are ever and ceaselessly at work in preparing the abstract mold, the privation of the future new being. So it's the skandhas. It's these attributes, it's these properties, these tendencies, these mental and moral and physical predispositions that constantly renew themselves, take themselves into new form. And so we begin to see that at this level, then, there is occurring a constant reincarnation, but HPB says that seems to be of less importance. Why does she give it second? Because what is important is the movement of another domain of our being to waken to it in a cyclic manner, which moves down, which brings about a complete change of the whole interior metempsychosis. The change of the total psychic nature, which is from the monastic to the physical. A total change of consciousness, which is again a cyclic process, which deals with what? The transformations of the thinking principle, chitta vritti nirodha, according to Patanjali. The whole dealing with the ways in which consciousness takes on, our minds take on all of these predispositions. We tend to think in the same way. When did you last have a really new idea? Say about reincarnation. Or I'm satisfied. I know all about it because I've lived. Well, you ought to know. We've all lived before. But who lived before? Not I, as Joy Mills. No. Never lived before. This is a unique occasion, as Tsongkhapa would call it. This is my present unique occasion. But what do? I hang on to the name, Rupa, the first of the skandhas, but the form has changed. Have my mental habits changed? My predispositions to doing things certain way, have those changed? To what extent? So this is the process, then, of metempsychosis. But beyond that is indeed a process that HPB doesn't speak about very much, and not in these terms, although she does speak about it in volume 12 of the collected writings. And it's a process that was well spoken of by St. Paul in his letter to the Romans. Unless ye be converted in your mind, a complete change. And in the Greek, it is metanoia. The complete change of nous, the true mind, monos, the complete change. And this is the process, which ultimately leads to becoming awake, in which then, for the Buddha, Gautama was still in a physical vehicle, achieved enlightenment in a physical vehicle as Gautama, went forth in a physical vehicle to the deer park at Sarnath to preach his first sermon, the first turning of the wheel, fully awake. So here, then, bringing that into that whole, the upadhi will hold it. Here and now, in this. Here is the process. And this is the whole development of the cycle. The Mahatmas say, the skandhas, at the same time, they are ever and ceaselessly at work in preparing the abstract mold, which is the upadhi. The privation, because it is a privation, it's limiting. And this is the supreme sacrifice of the gods, isn't it? The supreme sacrifice is to limit, to be held within. So from the cycle of necessity, of being bound, one is now self-bound, if you like to put it that way. We self-bind ourselves. We are willing to undergo, which is to suffer, the burden of incarnation. As the Mahatma goes on to say, if it is just that a man of 40 should enjoy or suffer for the actions of the man of 20, so it is equally just that the being of the new birth, who is essentially identical with the previous being, since he is its outcome and creation, should feel the consequences of that begetting self or personality. So what you see is what you beget. I come back to what I had up there in the first morning. Because we are constantly begetting the new personality until we come even a partially awake. And then we begin to see that within this is this wholeness, the possibility of moving beyond it, of really liberating and yet self-binding. And this has so changed my own life that I share it with you as an idea that can shape our lives in a totally new way and bring us into a new understanding of reincarnation. Many scholars criticized HPB very much for the fact that she doesn't mention reincarnation as such in Isis Unveiled. Why didn't she mention it? Didn't she know about it? Or was it because this is indeed one of the greatest secrets of occultism? Because it shatters, utterly shatters, the idea of a personal self when it's looked at properly. And it utterly shatters the concept of personal survival. That, I think, is something we don't realize because we want to hold on to this personal self. This we've built up. This we cherish. But when looked at fully, you can say, well, what about the communications, the things that come to us? from the lower astral. What about breaking that threshold into that condition after death known as devachan? That condition which the Mahatmas give a great deal of attention to, in which there is no personal survival. And what do the Mahatmas say? And HPB, in her esoteric teachings, karma, with its army of skandhas, awaits the new being. But it will be only a repetition of the old being unless we, here, now, undergo a process of purification, of cleansing, of shattering, which is what is yoga, a process of shattering what we think of as the I that's going to reincarnate. And out of that to form a totally new structure, adapted to a totally new mode of being. And this is the process that she speaks of first, metempsychosis, and then metanoia, and then wake up.